Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jerry Davis, the Gilbert and Ruth Whitaker Professor of Business Administration and Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Davis earned his PhD from Stanford University and previously taught at Northwestern University and Columbia University. A distinguished scholar, he is a fellow of multiple academic societies, including the Academy of Management and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Professor Davis has held key leadership roles, including editor-in-chief of Administrative Science Quarterly, inaugural Associate Dean for Business Plus Impact, and co-founder of Responsible Research in Business and Management. He has mentored over 85 doctoral dissertations and published extensively across management, sociology, and finance. Dr. Davis is the author of 6 books and numerous articles spanning the field of management, sociology, and finance. His research explores corporate governance, economic inequality, platform capitalism, and the future of shareholder capitalism. His latest work examines how AI is transforming scholarship and the design of economic organizations for a more democratic and human future. In this episode, Professor Jerry Davis will share key insights from his book, Taming Corporate Power in the 21st Century. So, without further delay, let's welcome Professor Jerry Davis to the podcast. Professor Davis, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you so much, Deepak. I'm really glad to be speaking with you.
Professor Davis, you argue that traditional economic categories like nationality, industry, and firm size no longer accurately reflect the realities of the modern economy. What are the key forces driving this shift, and how should we rethink these concepts?
No, thanks for the question. If you look at the modern economy today, the categories that we've used for a century, like American company or Indian company or automotive industry or big employer, they really don't mean what they used to. So take a company like DoorDash. Have you heard of DoorDash?
Yes.
Yeah. So DoorDash operates in 30 countries. They have 8 million dashers, the people that do the delivery. They have about 42 million monthly active users. As of today, the company's worth $75 billion. So is DoorDash a big company?
Yeah.
Hard question.
Yes.
Um, they only have 23,700 employees in the world. That's about one employee for every 337 dashers. So the vast majority of the work is done by contractors who are not employees of the company. So that's strange. Are they big or small? Depends on what we mean by big. And then you could ask, what industry is it in? So, Deepak, do you have any thoughts about if you had to categorize DoorDash, what industry would you think about putting them in?
Technology?
Yeah, technology would be a good bet. I mean, you could think so they deliver food to people's doors, so maybe restaurants. You could
Yes.
think about them being delivery or logistics. You could think about them as a software company since that's what a lot of their work does. But when they did their initial public offering in December 2020, they listed their industry as SIC code 7389, which means business services not elsewhere classified. So, not food or restaurants, not technology, not delivery or logistics. They just said we're a business service. And that feels like it's kind of the nub of the problem is that so much of what happens in the economy today happens through software, through screens, through platforms or intermediaries, and it really scrambles a lot of the categories that we use to understand the economy.
The call for reviving antitrust laws is growing, but you suggest that these laws are based on the outdated framework. What fundamental changes are needed to make antitrust effective in today's digital economy?
Yeah, great question. Our antitrust frameworks were really built for a different economy. So you think about, the Magna Carta, the birthstone in a sense for antitrust was the Sherman Act, and it was written in 1890. So at that time, a monopoly looked something like Standard Oil. And the assumption was you could measure power by looking at market share or price hikes. But today, big tech firms often give their products away for free. They make money by harvesting data or locking you into ecosystems. So the power isn't really about price necessarily. It's about infrastructure and influence and being the only viable platform. So how would we create the tools to handle something that looks like um, that takes on sort of the new nature of the economy? I was just thinking about the two biggest phone companies in the US are AT&T and T and Verizon, and then there's sort of T-Mobile. But do they also compete with Skype or with Zoom or with Google Teams or Microsoft products? So it's kind of hard to draw where the boundaries are, and that makes things complicated. I do have to say though, my thinking about this has evolved a bit since the book came out because Lena Khan, who is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, has just been a lot more brilliantly aggressive than I expected anyone could be with antitrust. So my thinking did evolve a little bit since the book came out.
Professor Davis, many believe that big companies have become too powerful. So, in what ways does their dominance differ from traditional monopolies, and what strategies could effectively curb their influence?
Yeah, one way to think about this is to look back a century or so to think about who were the biggest companies in the Dow Jones Index. So when the Clayton Act was passed in 1914, one of the most important pieces of antitrust legislation, uh, the list of the company names made it really clear what it would look like to dominate that market. So there was Amalgamated Copper, American Sugar, National Lead, Central Leather, US Rubber, US Steel. They were all sort of tangible products that you could imagine what it looked like to dominate and monopolize that market. And today, big tech, they're not really in one single industry. Think about Google or Amazon. They're not as retailers or media companies, but they're more like gatekeepers for commerce and information and social connection. And their power just feels invisible, like surveillance data, algorithmic control, and not having control over some tangible physical thing. So, yeah, that's the thing. They're just so woven through people's daily lives that it can be very difficult to understand how do you rein something like that in.
You highlight how ICT has transformed market for capital, labor, and distribution. Could you elaborate on how these changes challenge traditional regulatory approaches?
Yeah. So I think about the iPhone and labor markets. So the iPhone came out in 2007. In the US, we distinguish between W-2 employees, which are people who are, literally employees of the company, versus 1099 employees who are contractors. The iPhone has really transformed what it means to have a job and to do a task. And we've really seen this evolution from people showing up as an employee, doing a particular job day in and day out for the same organization, and then they get their sort of Form W-2 at the end of the year to do their taxes. Now people can sign up to do work by the tasks, and that makes things really, really complicated. And the same basic process, the way that I describe it is that information and communication technologies or ICTs means that it's much easier to use markets rather than doing things internally. So instead of doing your own manufacturing, you might hire a contractor like Nike would do. Instead of doing your own distribution, you might hire Amazon Web Services to distribute your goods. And that's really sort of transformed what an organization, what a business might look like.
With companies operating across national borders and industries, how should we redefine what a corporation is and its responsibilities in the 21st century?
Yeah. So about 20 years ago, I published an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review trying to think about how do you how do we think about the responsibilities of corporations? Like, imagine that I'm Nestle, which is a Swiss company. They make cat food under the brand Ralston Purina. And it turns out that activists discovered that the shrimp that went into their seafood flavored cat chow was being caught by ships that had people operating in slave-like conditions off the coast of Thailand. And Nestle could say, but that's not us. That's a contractor that's bringing us the shrimp. It's not our responsibility um, to uh, to look out for the labor practices of ships off the coast of Thailand. But we thought that was not really a good answer. We wanted to know what would it look like for companies to be, more accountable for their supply chains. And our thought at the time was that the EU would end up being kind of the thoughtful regulator for the world, that the EU tended to have higher standards than other venues, and that global companies that operated across lots of boundaries, they would probably just adopt the highest standard all across their operations so that they could, live up to, say, the EU standards. I would say I am not as these days, in light of trade wars and some of the breakdown of globalization, I'm not exactly sure how to think about that anymore. Sort of the legal domicile of the corporation seems to be a lot more flexible, so that if a company isn't happy with the laws that they get in Delaware, they might reincorporate in Texas, as Tesla is trying to do, or they could reincorporate in Bermuda. And so it feels like it's a lot harder to hold corporations accountable than it used to be, just because of these sort of shifting boundaries.
Professor Jerry, the rise of gig work and platform-based labor has disrupted traditional employer-employee relationships. How should labor policies evolve to ensure fair treatment and economic security for workers?
Yeah, I love that question because it's one that I'm very anxious about. So I alluded to Uberization in a previous answer. I talked about sort of the Fair Labor Standards Act and going from W-2 to 1099. I would say broadly, what the gig economy is doing is transforming jobs into tasks. So a job is something that one person does. A task is a specific thing that you can sort of pay by the piece, so that you can pay workers for a specific delivery or a specific shift or accomplishing a specific task. And this ends up undermining the protections that were built into employment law. So, minimum wage, benefits, collective bargaining, at least in the US, these are things that go with being called an employee that you don't get as a contractor. They don't have the same kinds of protections. So, I'd say a few things we need. We need a portable benefits system. We need protections for contractors that look more like employment. I think we need policy tools that reflect the reality of these spot labor markets. I would say that California's Proposition 22, which passed in fall of 2020, it showed some of the danger of letting platform companies like Uber write the rules. We really need to have labor policy that is addressing what I would call algorithmic management.
Corporate influence extend beyond markets into politics and society. What risk does this pose to democratic institutions, and what safeguards could help restore balance?
Yeah, this is such a timely question for right now. I don't know how closely you're following politics in the U.S., but we're in a very, I would say, interesting period politically and economically. So you know that Elon Musk from Tesla and X and SpaceX, he's the richest person the world has ever known. He's the world's richest man, a centibillionaire. A lot of people believe that he essentially helped buy the 2024 election for Donald Trump. He donated something like $300 million to help get Trump elected, and then was quickly put into a non-official position in the administration where he and his collaborators in Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, are kind of going on a rampage to undermine the operations of the American bureaucracy. If you had to pick one single incident to summarize what can go wrong when corporate influence or the influence of the very wealthy extends into government, I think that would do the trick. The fact that Musk has so much impact on the operations of our vast federal government and its bureaucracy um, really shows some of the dangers to democracy of letting the extremely wealthy have these oligarchic positions. I guess I'd also point to some of my other writings about the ideology that seems to be built into Silicon Valley. I've described it as authoritarianism with Silicon Valley characteristics. um, Tech companies themselves are often organized on very authoritarian or autocratic bases. If you look at Google, the two founders control 60% of the voting rights. Facebook, it went public in 2012, giving Mark Zuckerberg, a 28-year-old college dropout, absolute control over electing the board of directors and the company's strategy. So, 28-year-old college dropout controlling a major global corporation with very limited oversight, that doesn't look so good. And I really fear taking that Silicon Valley founder-focused ideology and bringing it into the operations of what should be democratically accountable governments. Not always a popular viewpoint these days, but that's what makes me really anxious at this time.
Very insightful. Professor Jerry, you argue that outdated economic frameworks prevent effective regulation. What alternative tools or policy approaches do you propose to address corporate power more effectively?
Yeah, I think that we need new forms of democratic oversight. So, not just through competition law like antitrust, but through sectoral regulation. So, what I suggest in the book is that it might make sense to have a digital services regulator for platforms. So, kind of a specialized agency like in the US, the FCC or the FAA, something that's specialized to big tech that can understand the technology, keep up with it, and make sure that people don't pass through the agency and then immediately get a job with the companies that they used to regulate, because that creates bad incentives. Um, but I would want a digital services regulator, maybe data trusts for user rights, public options for key infrastructure like payments or logistics. I honestly think that the rest of the world could learn a lot from India in this case. That what India has done with digital infrastructure, making sure that everyone has an account, that even the poorest person um, has a digital account where they can accept payments or compensation. I think that India has been much more effective at making sure that people get, the compensation that's due to them, that the allocations that they're due to them, and it feels, as I understand it, it feels that um, India is using these tools in a way that builds in sort of robust competition at different aspects of the value chain. So and you can tell me if I get this right, but that if I order from something like Amazon, if I get to the delivery part, that they're required to offer me many options of different vendors for the delivery rather than sort of entrusting them. Is that accurate?
Yes, this is accurate information.
Yeah. So this is one of those cases where I'd say the world could learn a lot from India's experience with digital. So.
Yeah. Professor, as corporations operate on a global scale, what role should national government play in regulating corporate behavior? And is international cooperation necessary to create meaningful change?
Yeah, national governments still have a lot of real power. They control taxation, they control employment law, procurement, infrastructure, but it seems pretty clear that no single country can regulate global firms effectively by themselves. We need more international cooperation around things like tax justice, labor standards, climate policy. I think the EU has mostly been pretty good at this historically. At this historic moment, however, I am very anxious about the capacity of sort of the world's democracies like India and the US and the EU to collaborate effectively around these regulations because at least one of those places is not playing nice with its allies. And I think that in that it may be sacrificing its own credibility as an ally for efforts like this. So just not sure what comes next. Not to be Professor Buzzkill, but I have some anxiety about, the US's ability to participate thoughtfully in those efforts in the near term.
Professor, my last question. Looking ahead, do you see emerging trends such as decentralized finance, AI-driven business models, or platform cooperatives reshaping corporate power? And could they offer a path toward a more equitable economic system?
Yeah, thank you for giving me a nice hopeful question to end on. So I kind of feel like the technologies that we're relying on, the technologies that are enabling authoritarianism, more and more in the US right now, but around the world, those same tools could be used in much more democratic ways. So instead of saying, I'm going to use technology to monitor your emotions or to read all of your emails, we could say, how about we turn that around and say, hey, let's take a vote on X today, or let's gather information, or let's engage in a dialogue that draws on all the information at the front line. So I am cautiously optimistic that we could turn these tools in a more democratic a more democratic direction. So you mentioned platform cooperatives. There's examples of this. An acquaintance of mine in New York started a platform co-op for taxi drivers in New York City, where the drivers themselves, the more miles they drive, the more owners they become of the underlying business, because they're really contributing all of the value. In fact, I learned from him, from the founder, that the software to run this service only cost $10,000. So it wasn't the software of an Uber that's necessarily the constraint. You can get a pretty good knockoff version for not that much money. It's really the sweat equity of the drivers. So I think there's a lot of room for something like platform cooperatives and giving workers ownership. I also feel like AI could be used in more interesting and democratic ways to create alternative economic institutions that are more democratically accountable, that take more people's opinions. Going to the voting booth and voting yes or no is a very sort of gross form of participation. But we could, using AI today, you could have 1,000 people on a call putting in much more dense input and use AI models to pull out what are the major trends. So I feel like if we have the right, smart people like yourself, or our students at the university, that we could be building more democratic infrastructure to make the economy more responsive and more democratic. So that is my hopelessly romantic and democratic response to your thoughts there.
Yeah. That brings us to the end of this insightful conversation with Professor Jerry Davis. His deep expertise in corporate governance, economic power, and the evolving role of technology has given us much to reflect on. Taming corporate power in the 21st century presents a compelling case for rethinking our framework to address the challenges of the modern economy. Professor Davis, thank you for sharing your valuable insights and thought-provoking perspectives. It has been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Deepak. I really appreciate the conversation.